All right, welcome back everyone to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig and I'm the founder and co-director of Jane Austen and Company. We are so pleased to see everyone here tonight for the fifth event in our series, Asia and the Regency. Tonight, we welcome Tristanne Connolly to talk about Emma in Bollywood, the small world of Aisha. I'm really excited for this talk for two reasons. One, because it gave me an excuse to rewatch Aisha, which is such a cute adaptation of Emma. But two, because Tristanne is the co-editor of the forthcoming volume on Austen and Asia that is co-edited by our very own Kimio Ogawa. And many of the talks we've had in the series so far have actually come from papers in this book. So we're really, really excited to have the co-editor of what is going to be a very important volume. For those of you who are joining us tonight for the first time, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our mission is to bring free events and workshops on Jane Austen and her broader global context to audiences around the world. Tonight, I am joined by my co-hosts, Dr. Kimio Ogawa and Dr. Inga Brody, as well as our technical director, Jared Powell. And I'm going to hand things over now to Inga to talk more about what this series means.
Hi, everyone. I'm a professor in the same department as Anne and Jared at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm also in the Asian Studies and Global Studies programs. I'm the one who co-founded and direct this Jane Austen Summer Program, again, which is the umbrella organization for JA & Co. And in case you don't know the history behind it, Jane Austen Company began as a library outreach program, and where we had maybe 1 or 2 dozen people at a time at local libraries. But during COVID, Anne and I decided to take the format online, and we started first with the series Staying Home with Jane Austen, and then followed by Race in the Regency. Each event in these two series attracted hundreds of visitors from around the world. And we hope that this series on the Regency and Asia will continue to lead towards increasingly international, diverse, and three-dimensional representations of life in the Regency. We are, in a sense, unmasking the Regency, considering the COVID context as well. Our speakers are unmasking the far more complex position of international cultural exchange at the time. And discourses on race. And it's also just really nice to see people's faces in this open and cordial exchange of ideas. And we realized that none of our presentations during the Race and the Regency series dealt with Asia and Asians. And so that is part of the reason behind this series. This week, our talk will explore Asian interpretations of Austen's novel Emma, as well as of Austen's cultural afterlives. I think that I will hand it off to Kimio.
Thank you. Okay, so Tristanne Connolly is Associate Professor in the English Department at St. Jerome's University at the University of Waterloo. She's the author of William Blake and the Body, along with many articles on British Romantic literature in relation to science, medicine, and gender and sexuality, and also religion. Since Dr. Connolly has been interested in the representation of the body and sexuality, she's done research on many medical texts, including those by Erasmus Darwin, he's Charles Darwin's grandfather. So her current projects include an online edition of Erasmus Darwin's The Loves of the Plants. Just to give some information on the poem, for those people who aren't familiar with it, Darwin was interested in describing the reproductive structures and habits of plants, mainly female plants. Plant female, as in pistils, creating a vivid picture of the women invoked in his verse. I'm hoping to hear something about this as well in maybe the Q&A session today in relation to Austen's work, since some characters in her novels curiously resonate with Darwin's plant women. Dr. Connolly has also edited 9 essay collections and is currently co-editing Austen in Asia with me, as was introduced before. Some of the speakers in Asia and the Regency are contributors of this upcoming book. So I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Connolly to talk about Austen today. So I'm going to hand over to Jared now.
Yes. So before we get into Dr. Connolly's lecture, I'd like to take a few minutes to explain how tonight's event will work. The event will last about 90 minutes in total. And as you know, many of you are familiar, we have, let me share my screen here, Q&A opportunities and chat here on Zoom. And so just to break down the difference here between these two, if you would like to ask questions for Professor Connolly to answer in the Q&A at the end of the talk, you want to be sure to direct those to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. And then at the end of the talk, Kimio, Inga, and Anne will rotate through and choose questions from that list. And if you want to have conversation with other attendees and make comments on the talk as it goes along, you will put those in the chat. But just be sure when you're in the chat that you change this little drop-down menu to everyone. It might be hosts and panelists by default, so you'll want to be sure to change that. So questions for our speaker in Q&A, conversation with other attendees in the chat. And on the subject of the chat, we usually do enjoy quite a robust chat. And if you would like to hide that and the little notification icons that come up if that distracts you, I've assembled a few tips here for how you can do that. So if you're on a Windows PC, what you're going to want to do is click your chat icon, and then it should automatically pop up in a separate window. And you just click that, the top of that window, and drag it to the bottom or to the side of the screen out of your way. And if you are on Mac, it's a similar process. There's just one extra step. You click that chat button again, and instead of a pop-up, it's just typically going to come out as a sidebar. So you click the drop-down caret and then change that to pop out, and then again, click it and drag off screen. And then finally, if you're joining us on mobile or on a tablet, it's just, again, a similar process. You click that chat button, but then you'll click the bell icon here to mute the notifications. And again, as usual, for the first few minutes, or throughout the entire talk, actually, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have technical problems, just be sure to put a message in there and I'll reach out. And with that, I believe I'm sending things back to Anne.
Thank you so much, Jared. Please note that tonight's program will be recorded. It usually is up online in about a week's time, and we'll notify you all on our Facebook page and our website when it is available to view. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Tristanne Connolly.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kimio, and thank you, all of you, for inviting me to be part of this fabulous series. I'm very happy to be here. I will just get started by sharing my screen. Before Emma, Austen wrote Mansfield Park, about an insular country house with a patriarch who goes to Antigua and a heroine who reads about China and is herself an importation from a port city. Emma has a patriarch who hardly wants to go out the front door, and a heroine who doesn't go to London and hasn't seen the sea. Box Hill is about as far as she gets. Usually, travel is necessary to action and romance, and this is an idea that Austen plays with from her earliest writing, such as The Beautiful Cassandra, written when she was 12, where the heroine ventures a whole 4 miles from the West End of London to Hampstead, where she was no sooner arrived than she ordered the coachman to turn round and drive her back again. If it was a challenge for Austen to make a happy ending out of Emma not escaping her limited setting and ending up marrying the family friend who's always been there, it's even more of a challenge to update and urbanize the story without changing that ending. Clueless transferred the action from Highbury, a village almost amounting to a town, to Los Angeles, and Aisha, which owes a lot to Clueless, sets the story in Delhi. Both films show the heroines driving recklessly around the city, foregrounding the mobility Emma can't enjoy, yet showing it doesn't really take them anywhere. Clueless and Aisha both keep the heroines' world small by showing how narrow their social circles and worldviews are, even in such big cosmopolitan settings. But a significant difference is that Los Angeles can actually be considered, in many ways, the center of the world. Highbury, though only 16 miles from London, is decidedly provincial. Delhi is, without doubt, a world-class city, but it ain't Hollywood. It's not even Bollywood. Setting Austen's story in a place that has a colonial history under the British, and, like much of the rest of the world, continues to experience Western and particularly American cultural and economic imperialism, Aisha invites a comparison between the provincial and the post-colonial or neo-colonial. And as a reimagined Emma, it reflects on how center and periphery shape this heroine. Not only her relationship to the wider world, but also to the characters who have greater experience of that wider world than she does. Emma and Aisha need to be at the center of everything, perhaps because they're not at the center of the world. They react to a nagging sense that they're only big fish because they're in a small pond. Chakraborty and Chatterjee insightfully argue that the film Aisha suffers from a colonial hangover. But I'd argue that just like the novel, the film immerses us in the heroine's unreliable point of view, and it's Aisha who has a colonial hangover, and the film is about how she can get over it. If Emma and Aisha are the kind of typical Austen heroine who comes to a moral realization about herself and her relation to others over the course of the narrative, what they learn is that it's all right not to be at the center, egotistically or geographically. Aisha, unusually, doesn't feature any foreign locations, in contrast to the two Bollywood blockbusters it explicitly references, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai and Kabhi Khushi Kabhie Gham, also known as K3G, both directed by Karan Johar. The action in Aisha only goes as far as Rishikesh for a whitewater rafting excursion and Mumbai for a visit to Aisha's sister. In Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, the dance sequence for the title song takes place in various locations in Scotland for no apparent reason other than the enjoyment of exotic locations, unless it alludes to the female love interest's recent return from London, where, it's said, she was studying at Oxford University. If Oxford is in London in the world of the movie, maybe Scotland is too, in the kind of careless geographical and cultural blur through which Westerners often see Asia too. In K3G, in the number Diwana Hai Dekho, the characters Rohan and Pooja, or Pooh, who are actually in London according to the plot, are shown being effortlessly cool all over town and beyond. They dance in front of Blenheim Palace and inside the British Museum. They wear glamorous Western clothes with multiple costume changes over the 5-minute song. There are masses of Western backup dancers, apparently close friends and distant admirers of Pooh and Rohan. We all watch Rohan as he drives up in a Lamborghini, then rocks a classic red Fender Stratocaster guitar, then dominates at football. It's not just evident that Rohan and Pooh are seamlessly integrated into affluent Western culture, but that affluent Western culture is also seamlessly Indian. All of these English people in the background spontaneously take to Bollywood-style dancing and singing, with mainly Hindi lyrics, even though these unrealistic musical outbursts are supposed to be so alienating to Western audiences. Though Bollywood dance segments traditionally show a fantasy untethered from any conflicts or restrictions in the rest of the narrative, In K3G, the fantasy of international wealth pervades the world of the movie, most iconically when Rohan's brother, Rahul, arrives home just in time for the Diwali festival in the family helicopter. In Aisha, the West is off-screen in the backstories of the returnee characters. The Frank Churchill character, Dhruv, has been living in London. The Jane Fairfax character, Arti, has been living in New York. Even the Mr. Knightley character, Arjun, though his name captures Indianness as perfectly as Mr. Knightley's captures Englishness, since Arjuna is the heroic warrior from the Bhagavad Gita, part of the national epic, the Mahabharata. Even Arjun went to an American Ivy League business school, and when we meet him, he's just come back from London. There's an easy interchange between India and the West for these returnee characters. But Aisha, with no actual international experience, can only claim cosmopolitan sophistication indirectly and tenuously. One main way she does this is through her access to Western fashion. Among the film's sponsors are L'Oreal, Dior, and DLF Emporio, India's luxury mall. And the movie was considered pioneering in Bollywood for the way it featured haute couture. Some critics wrote it off as a shallow and shameless fashion parade. Even the actor playing Arjun, Abhay Deol, notoriously commented, "The movie had nothing to do with Jane Austen's Emma. It was more about clothes than actual acting." The movie, it seems, is just like its heroine, in danger of seeming like a wannabe. The returnee characters have the look and the experience of cosmopolitan sophistication. Aisha only has the look. The link between sophistication and westernization is emphasized through the Harriet Smith character, Shefali. Early scenes with her establish several signals of status. Clothing is one. Not only wearing Western clothing, but knowing when to wear Western clothing. Another is being able to switch freely between Hindi and English. In the scene of Aisha's art exhibition, Shefali is established as a village girl, or a behenji, literally meaning sister, a derogatory word for a girl who's traditional and not sexy. She claims to be an artist too because she did a home decoration course at college in Bahadurgarh, where she comes from, a suburb about 30 kilometers from Delhi. And she freely admits that the reason she's in Delhi is for her aunt and uncle to arrange a marriage for her. The reactions of Aisha and her best friend Pinky, that's the Dion character in Clueless who doesn't have an equivalent in Emma, show how embarrassingly lame they find everything Shefali says. Pinky actually laughs at her and rudely repeats 2 English words she uses incorrectly. Drawings for all the art, and hi-fi to mean modern. Aisha, in her version of arranging marriages, makes a point of introducing Shefali to Randir, the Mr. Elton character. Because Shefali is wearing an Indian-style outfit, salwar kameez, Randir assumes that she's just come from a wedding. He asks Aisha if she's coming to the polo match that afternoon. Aisha says Shefali's coming too, and he tells her, "The dress code is Western, but you can wear anything. Summer dress, hat, you can wear a hat." Shefali nervously asks Aisha, "Do we need to wear something special?" And Aisha excitedly responds, "Don't worry, we'll go shopping." While Randir, Pinky, and Aisha are all condescending to Shefali in this scene, Arjun evidently feels for her and treats her kindly. Aisha, Pinky, and Randir are not returnees, and perhaps deep down feel uncomfortably close to Shefali in having to learn to perform the correct degree of westernization required for status without the benefit of Western experience. "Don't worry, we'll go shopping" means that Aisha sets herself up as the authority who'll teach Shefali how to dress comme il faut. Though in the novel, Emma and Harriet do go shopping, fashion isn't an important part of their relationship. But in the visual medium of film, Clueless and in turn Aisha use a makeover montage to show the heroine's attempt to transform her little friend. The montage in Aisha features all of the fashion-related corporate sponsors of the movie and more. The girls go to DLF Emporio, and the camera wheels around showing the shops of Dior, Vuitton, and Ferragamo, and Aisha does Shefali's and her own makeup with L'Oreal products. The film includes Indian designers as well, but they're not featured so focally. Pinky wears Manish Arora, the first Indian designer to succeed in Paris, but the loud style he's famous for reflects her quirky personality and gets her called a circus tent. When Aisha's father confronts her about the credit card bill, she corrects his pronunciation of the name of the shop Ensemble. What's not mentioned, but would be known by fashionistas in the audience, is that Ensemble, with its French name, is a boutique that represents itself as championing the Make in India movement since the 80s, featuring Indian designers and traditional outfits like lehengas and saris. Haute couture is evidently a vibrant international mix, but the film emphasizes its Western elements, perhaps suffering from a colonial hangover, or perhaps purposely showing the disproportionate value Aisha places on Western savvy, which lets her show off to her father as well as to Shefali. The film gives Shefali further opportunities to display her lack of Western savvy in two scenes with significant settings: a yoga class and the previously mentioned polo match. The yoga class follows the art opening, but precedes the makeover, so Shefali is again seen wearing Indian clothing, and her cotton kurta keeps riding up on her, while Aisha and Pinky wear Western-style stretch yoga clothes. We hear the yoga teacher's voice, speaking English with an English accent, but using the Sanskrit names for the poses, and we can see that Shefali doesn't know how to do the poses. Yoga and polo are, of course, Indian traditions that have been imported into the West and gained a certain cultural cachet there. The film shows that they've become so westernized that they're incomprehensible to the Behenji Shefali, who calls polo hockey on a horse. Watching Randir play polo, Aisha comments to Shefali, "Isn't he looking like the Maharaja of Jodhpur?" Shefali answers, "His pants are really strange. They don't fit right." Aisha explains they're called Jodhpurs. This dialogue makes the Indian origins of this fashion and its name self-evident, and at the same time shows how those origins are obscured to Shefali. Of course, class is an element here too. These things are understood by upper-class Indians, but this shows how class and westernization go hand in hand. These upper-class fashionable activities and the clothes they require are westernized Indian, just like the people who participate in them and know how to dress for them. Even with its exclusively Indian settings, then, Aisha addresses ideological challenges that Bollywood has been facing under the influence of its growing diasporic audience since the 1990s, finding the right balance between enjoying the benefits of westernization and maintaining Indian identity. Aisha shows that, in the globalized world of the 21st century, this is a challenge to resident as well as non-resident Indians. But the movie also emphasizes the way Indian culture has infiltrated the West. Even before we come to the yoga, polo, and Jodhpurs, when we first meet Arjun, Aisha mocks him for always wearing designer suits and for buying Indian sweets in London. She exclaims, "Who gets rasgulla from London?" He answers in a familiar, almost brotherly, teasing joke that he passed a shop and saw them and they reminded him of her face. "I grew slightly emotional," he says, "so I bought them for you." If in Austen's novel Mr. Knightley is an exemplar of ideal Englishness, Arjun as ideal Indianness enjoys what Meenakshi Bharat calls hybrid cosmopolitanism. He likes the idea of seeing something Indian in London and bringing it back, while Aisha calls it pathetic. Aisha calls Arjun a corporate slave while she freely spends her father's money, but Aisha is extremely critical of Arti. At first, Arti seems to be an example of the non-resident Indian, or NRI, who has sold out her identity and values for success in the West. The first thing we see of Arti is her high-heeled shoes, then her legs, then her mini dress. But this is a moment where the movie replicates the dominance of the heroine's point of view in Emma. We see Arti when she walks into Arjun's office. Aisha walks into Arjun's office and finds her sitting on his desk. She's not perceived fairly as a person, but sized up as a rival. This biased perspective is confirmed in a shift of point of view when Pinky comments, "Someone's got a serious case of bitchitis." Aisha is influenced by unacknowledged jealousy over Arjun, but as with Jane Fairfax in the novel, there's also the more generalized jealousy over another woman with apparently superior claims to everyone's attention, who seems to have achieved feminine perfection. Arti appears after Aisha has set herself up as authoritative instructor to Shefali in Western sophistication. Arti undermines that authority with her mastery of the West as a successful returnee. And Aisha consistently tries to undermine Arti in turn, in waspish ways like purposely getting her name wrong every time they meet, and also by calling her Western success into question. That first view of her legs implies that her business success isn't due to using her abilities, but to using her physical attractiveness. When they're properly introduced at the polo match, the first thing Aisha says to Arti is, "There's a recession going on in New York, right? That's why people are leaving New York and coming here. Is that why you're here, Ankita, right?" Aisha accuses Arti of going wherever the money is, her relation to place, whether New York or Delhi, being shallow and materialistic and driven by selfish gain. Arjun defends Arti. He says, "Sometimes people return because they miss their family and friends." This asserts a genuine connection to Delhi in terms of the family ties that are ideally meant to hold NRIs to India and traditional Indian values, according to the post-1990s New Bollywood formula. For instance, K3G is all about bringing the estranged son in London back to India and back into the family fold. And K3G is also all about how international money is not at odds with these traditional values. Language is another one of those traditional values. For a good while, we only hear Arti speaking English and without an Indian accent. But the moment we first hear her speak Hindi is revealing. On the whitewater rafting excursion to Rishikesh, she comforts Shefali, who had fallen in the water and had to be rescued. While Aisha lords her vicarious Western sophistication over Shefali, Arti, with her actual Western sophistication, puts herself on a level with Shefali by speaking in the language they share. But the scene that clinches Arti's Indian authenticity is where she sings a traditional song at the family Diwali celebrations and is admired and applauded. This is similar to a scene in Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, where the returnee character, on her first day at college back in India, is hazed by the boys. They demand that she sing for them in Hindi. After a long, suspenseful silence, she sings magnificently. And it's a traditional devotional song. When she concludes, she faces off the leader of the boys and says, all in Hindi of course, "In spite of staying in London or being brought up there, I haven't forgotten my values, and you better not forget that." After Arti's performance, Aisha sulks and complains to Arjun, "It seems like some parents are showing off their child who's in kindergarten. Baby, read out a poem for uncle. Baby, dance to the Kajra Ray song," as if Arti had learned Indianness by rote as a party piece. Kajra Ray was a huge hit from the movie Bunty Aur Babli 5 years before Aisha. It could be compared to the song Arti sings because it draws on traditional female-voiced devotional love complaints, But in contrast to Artie's modest, seated performance, it's sung by a courtesan character. So Aisha is again attributing Artie's success to sexual manipulation. Aisha likens a traditional song to a recent item number, the name for Bollywood dance sequences engineered to be gratuitously, objectifyingly sexy for the sake of popularity. If Aisha ignores that difference, then she knows Indian culture even less than she claims Artie does. And, in any case, cultural belonging may, after all, be a matter of performance. But Artie has mastered such performance better than Aisha. The reimagining of Jane Fairfax as Artie is a particularly interesting aspect of this film's interpretation of Emma. For Jane Fairfax, working for a living means the bleak prospect of being a governess, while for Artie it means independence, wealth, and international experience. This is an effect of modernizing the story, but perhaps especially an effect of modernizing it into a new Bollywood movie where the West is typically portrayed as an economic resource. The post-colonial context results in some clever reversals. Jane Fairfax doesn't travel outside of England, but she has the opportunity to go to Ireland, a colonized nation. Emphatically so, since Austen actually refers to the recent union by having Miss Bates mistakenly call Ireland a different kingdom and then correct herself. Artie's opportunity lies in New York, perhaps the ultimate neo-colonial center. Jane is also a returnee, but on a national rather than a global scale. The narrator tells us by birth she belonged to Highbury, but from a young age had lived with the Campbells entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time. Jane, the impoverished orphan, has traveled more than the rich and privileged Emma, and as a result has gained social knowledge and abilities that Emma lacks. Artie's enviable ability to function masterfully and gracefully in both American and Indian cultural environments calls attention to Jane Fairfax's enviable social success, from London to Weymouth to Highbury, and Ireland too, without even being there, as the Campbells repeat their warm invitations for her to join them. With no experience of the wider world, Emma invents the non-existent forbidden love between Jane and Mr. Dixon as a kind of mental travel. It's also a kind of colonial projection, as seen in national tales of Austen's time. Places like Ireland are foreign enough to be exotic, yet can also be claimed as part of English territory or territory of the English imagination. Trying to fathom why Jane would choose to come to Highbury instead of Ireland, Emma says to Frank Churchill, "Here she must be leading a life of privation and penance. There it would have been all enjoyment." In addition to the irony of this as applied to Jane and Frank's situation, it might also show Emma's relative valuation of Highbury and Ireland. That kind of romance, to Emma's mind, doesn't happen in Highbury. Forbidden love is located in the Ireland of her mind. Such imaginism, and Frank's exploitation of it, causes her to completely miss that a secret engagement, the stuff of novels, is happening right under her nose. Austen, in her famous novel-writing advice to her niece Anna, wrote, "Let the Portmans go to Ireland, but as you know nothing of the manners there, you had better not go with them. You will be in danger of giving false representations." Emma is wrong about Jane and Ireland. Similarly, Aisha is wrong about Artie and New York. Aisha scornfully calls Artie a New York returned wannabe. This is another kind of projection. Aisha turns her own insecurity outward onto Artie. Priya Joshi mentions both the NRI and the wannabe NRI as visible players in the new Indian world of post-1990s economic liberalization and correspondingly in new Bollywood movies. We can see Aisha as a wannabe NRI, though she will not see herself this way. The film gives a post-colonial dimension to the female rivalry that makes Emma avoid friendship with the accomplished Jane Fairfax, who makes her look and feel inferior, in favor of befriending the nice but dim and pliable Harriet, who makes her look and feel superior. In the novel, Mr. Knightley is the only one who calls the heroine on her treatment of Harriet. And in Aisha, the first time Arjun sees the made-over Shefali, he says, "I think, Aisha, let's change Shefali's name. You've changed her completely. When you've given her a personality like yours, then she should have a similar name as well. Let's think. Aisha, Zaisha, Waisha, Maisha. How about that?" This twinning aspect isn't emphasized in the novel. In the film, we have Aisha the wannabe creating a wannabe. Shefali becomes a copy of a copy. But also absent from the novel is any reprimand from Harriet about Emma's opinion of her. Several adaptations include such a scene, notably Clueless, and Aisha follows suit. This could be due to modern wishes for a classless society. Deidre Shauna Lynch finds that not one movie version of Emma preserves the hard-headed lesson about class distinction by which Harriet drops out of the social picture at the end of the novel. But in Aisha, this alteration of the novel has a post-colonial edge. Shefali's reprimand is about culture as well as class, and confirms that Aisha's project of improving her is a project of westernization. Shefali confesses her love for Arjun, and Aisha responds, "But Shefali, you and Arjun are different." The real issue, though, is the difference between Shefali and Aisha. Shefali retorts, "What do you mean different? Because I don't wear good clothes like you do? Because I don't speak English like you do? My father isn't as rich as you are? I'm middle class? Because I'm a villager, right? I understand everything, Aisha. You never considered me your friend. I'm just a project." The only English words in her speech are middle class and project. Chakraborty and Chatterjee consider the Aisha-Shefali relationship a main example of the film's colonial hangover. They go so far as to say that Aisha shoulders the white man's burden to civilize the uncivilized, acculturate the uncultured, and to appropriate the other. Shefali herself sees it this way. "Cut that poor thing's hair. Give that poor thing some clothes." Chakraborty and Chatterjee find that Shefali decided to write back to the acculturation project of Aisha by rejecting her matchmaking and marrying Sohrab, the Robert Martin character. But evidently she talks back quite directly in this added confrontation scene, which becomes a turning point for Aisha in getting over her own colonial hangover. Wannabe status is built into the colonial project. Homi Bhabha quotes Macaulay's vision from his 1835 Minute on Indian Education of a class of interpreters between us and the millions we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The importance of style is reflected in tastes being first on the list, and put together with those deeper qualities. But as Bhabha points out, for this mimic man, to be anglicized is emphatically not to be English. The mimic remains a wannabe, almost the same, but not quite. I'd argue that Artie and the other returnees in the film go beyond the position of interpreters between to take full place equally in the Western world and in India. But Aisha is reluctantly and painfully aware that for her, who stays at home, to be westernized is emphatically not to be Western. For Bhabha, the slippage inherent in mimicry causes a dangerous uncertainty to rebound back on the colonizer. A brief definition of mimicry from the Oxford Dictionary of Critical Theory puts it well. The colonial power desires its subjugated others to look or at least act the same as the occupiers, and yet fear that very outcome because it would dilute their own sense of difference and superiority. It would also allow the others to claim the privileges attached to that difference and superiority. In the film, Aisha's insistence that Shefali is different means that Arjun is out of Shefali's league. And Shefali, attacking both assumptions, claims romantic and social opportunities equal to Aisha's. In the novel, Harriet tells Emma that, without her encouragement, I never should have presumed to think of Mr. Knightley, but now I seem to feel that I may deserve him. Both heroines take for their project someone they think could never rival them, but then that very control brings their subjugated others up to rival status. But of course, Aisha is not the colonizer. She's not the civilizing white man. She can't be. She's the interpreter between, and only gains the limited degree of privilege, status, and identity that mimicry offers, almost, but not quite. If it's in marrying Sohrab that Shefali resists Aisha's dominance, then it's a matter of Shefali realizing that she doesn't want the privileges that come from mimicry. At first, it would seem that she wants what Aisha offers. In a scene soon after her makeover, she enthuses about an outfit Kareena Kapoor wore in K3G. She says, I'll wear the same exact dress on my wedding day, and asks Aisha, will you help me get it? She wants access to designer fashion, yet talking about her wedding day follows from just as enthusiastically mentioning that her aunt showed me photographs of boys yesterday for arranged marriage, and you know, some of them were really sweet. Aisha and Pinky both clearly pity her naivety. Shefali asks Pinky, have you seen Kabhi Khushi Kabhie Gham? And Pinky replies very sarcastically, yes, I have. As if to say, of course she has. She hasn't been living under a rock. They evidently think Shefali's admiration of the outfit is quaint, probably because it was massively trendy almost a decade earlier. Shefali wants access to designer fashion through Aisha, but isn't savvy about the kind of designer fashion Aisha endorses. But perhaps Shefali is more savvy than she seems. The costumes for K3G were designed by Manish Malhotra, also the designer for Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, where he introduced designer athletic wear to Bollywood, and the hero mainly wore, of all things, polo sport by Ralph Lauren. His designs for Kareena Kapoor in K3G were inspired by NRI culture. He said in an interview that he found the millennials were really torn by their environment and family values, which were completely different from the world they were living in. I wanted to show this paradox. Her look was modern Western, but the essence was Indian, and the result was that it resonated so well with girls across the country and worldwide. Unlike Aisha, Shefali doesn't want European haute couture, but an Indian designer's melding or even appropriation of modern Western with an Indian essence. While Aisha attaches a projected superiority to the Western culture she has no direct experience of, Shefali, in this way at least, is more like the returnee characters who see West and East as equal and treat her as an equal, and don't harbor illusions of a more exciting and glamorous elsewhere. Once Aisha has been told off for her behavior by Arjun and Shefali and Pinky, there's a montage of her feeling sorry for herself, parallel and opposite to the earlier makeover montage. A feature of this montage is food and drink. Aisha drinks a lot of champagne at a bar and then more afterwards straight from the bottle. She eats chocolate cake out of the pan and chocolate ice cream out of the carton. These are all Western, and champagne, of course, signals luxury. The ice cream does too, because it's recognizable as Haagen-Dazs. It so happens that the first Haagen-Dazs shop in Delhi opened in DLF Emporio, just months before the release of Aisha, and caused a controversy over a publicity stunt that offered an exclusive preview for international travelers, making it appear that it was for foreigners only. The journalist who broke the story complained of the company appealing to Indian insecurity. We think anything is good only if it's approved by foreigners. The unsatisfying apology from the Indian franchisee explained, the message was intended to suggest that you can enjoy, for instance, a taste of the French Riviera without traveling to France by enjoying Haagen-Dazs. Just the kind of cosmopolitanism by consumption that Aisha pursues. The montage of Aisha's misery also includes memories of eating an Indian frozen treat with Arjun, gola or chuski. And what finally gets her out of her funk is a late-night heart-to-heart with her father over gajar ka halwa. Unlike Mr. Woodhouse, Aisha's father loves sweets and is a wise and sympathetic romantic advisor, and also has a balanced perspective on the relation between home and the outside world. The character difference is like a statement that Mr. Woodhouse's aversion to change and other places would, in a post-colonial setting, be too much like xenophobia or insular nationalism, and so are not admitted into this Indian Emma. Aisha's father also underscores modern opportunities and mobility available to this heroine. He's got her a job in Mumbai. But he says, look, don't go if you don't want to. You won't get such delicious halwa there. When she finally confesses that she's troubled because she's in love with Arjun, her father is surprised but overjoyed. Arjun, our child! Wow, wonderful! What a correct choice! This response emphasizes how Aisha, like Emma, makes a match that keeps her precisely where she is and reinforces existing family ties. Family is highlighted even more when he exhorts her to go to Arjun and declare her love. He says, Kapoors don't brood. We believe in action. This has a further metafictional layer. The actor playing Aisha Kapoor is Sonam Kapoor, and her father and sister Anil Kapoor and Rhea Kapoor are producers of the film. And these Kapoors are cousins of the Kapoors who are the first family of Indian cinema. The director of Kuch Kuch Hota Hai and K3G, Karan Johar, is also part of a Bollywood family. Sangeeta Gopal focuses on the love affair with the family in Karan Johar's films and their active solicitation of a diasporic audience, since the ideology of the undivided Indian family links to the nation to the diaspora, and also evokes a sentimental relation to the family trope in Hindi cinema, even while reinventing it. Aisha demonstrates that with increasing globalization, resident as well as non-resident Indians need to affirm linkage to the nation. But since it also demonstrates that the nation itself has changed and become globalized, rather what is needed is to find an identity that goes beyond a residual sense of colonial inferiority, yet doesn't react into a defensive nationalism. To find a balance between here and elsewhere that is also a balance between self and other. In the end, Aisha gets over her colonial hangover through a personal transformation just like Emma's, changing her point of view and fixing her relationships. Aisha's reconciliation with Pinky, for instance, is also a reconciliation to the world they find themselves in. Pinky, too, finds love with someone she already knows, Rantir, the Mr. Elton character, and she speaks explicitly about staying local. This isn't a fairy tale, it's Delhi. There are no rainbows, only smoke from the traffic. If you can see one clear star in the sky at night, then that's more than enough. Her words confirm the movie's representation of Delhi as hardly a prime location. But they suggest that perhaps nowhere is a fairy tale. New York, LA, and London have their fair share of traffic and pollution too. There isn't anywhere that is the place to be, to the exclusion of all other places. There isn't anywhere that's definitively superior, except in the imagination. It's relationality that really puts a person at the center of the world. Pinky says, I'm not the most beautiful girl in the world, but for Randir, I am. Emma doesn't have the choice of taking a job in another city. Aisha does, and turns it down. But even her opportunity to leave Delhi is tied to family, and that job would have kept her in the same world. It's not an international job, was arranged for her by her father. Mumbai is where her sister lives. There's no escape. But the characterization of Aisha's father alleviates these effects. Sangeeta Gopal argues that New Bollywood's redefinition of the family includes the significant change that parents and relatives are no longer the obstacles to romance, but the enablers. But Aisha's father goes further. Unlike the grandmother and daughter in Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, he doesn't spend the movie in sneaky matchmaking machinations to get the couple together. He coaxes Aisha to articulate what she really wants, beginning with whether she really wants the job in Mumbai and ending with who she really loves. The progression from Western to Indian comfort food is paralleled in the film as a whole by a progression from Western to Indian music and style. Since the film visually replicates the dominance of the heroine's point of view, this progression can be taken as the transformation of Aisha's perspective. It's most clearly accentuated in the weddings that frame the movie. The first one is predominantly Western with Indian elements, while the last one is predominantly Indian with Western elements. While at the first wedding, the women wear a variety of modern, blingy Indian formal outfits, at the second, they wear traditional saris. The contrast is especially noticeable in the clothing of the men who, at the first wedding, mostly wear Western suits, including the groom, while at the second, nearly all of them, and certainly all of the main characters, wear wedding turbans, some with gold trim, and deep red kurtas, or, in the case of the groom, a sherwani. Perhaps most significantly, Arti wears the clothing and jewelry of a traditional South Indian bride. The first wedding has some random dancing by the guests to the Western pop-style theme tune that carries over from the opening sequence. The other scenes with music are all montages, except for one party scene, which is represented realistically, apart from the dance skill involved, and the music and choreography there are Spanish style. So the second wedding is the only time the movie approaches the familiar style of a Bollywood song and dance sequence, with formal, typically Bollywood dance moves and plenty of stagey front-facing group choreography. Yet it's combined with more informal, realistic wedding dancing by the guests in the background and by each of the couples. In fact, they look like they're imitating the moves to a Bollywood hit, as would happen at an Indian party or wedding in real life. And when we see Pinky and Randir, they're imitating a cool Hollywood dance move. They pass their fingers in front of their eyes like John Travolta in Pulp Fiction. Significantly, this final wedding is one that Aisha participates in, contrasting the initial wedding, which she controls. There, she's not only the matchmaker who brings her auntie and Colonel Singh together, these are the equivalents of Mr. and Mrs. Weston, she's also the wedding planner, and the wedding can't go on without her. The reason she's speeding through Delhi in her yellow Volkswagen Beetle at the beginning of the movie turns out to be that she has the ring, as we learn when she swoops into the wedding just in time. The contrast between the first and last wedding scenes, then, puts in parallel the movement from predominantly Western style to predominantly Indian style, and Aisha's movement from control to participation. In effect, Aisha is released from her assumption that Westernization requires imperial relations. The movie's happy ending, in true New Bollywood form, pictures an ideal Indianness that combines globalization and modernization with traditional values embodied in family and community. In Mansfield Park, Edward Said picks up on the phrase, something wanting within, extending it beyond Sir Thomas's shallow daughters to the house and the nation where the only things of value had to be imported from outside, whether in the form of wealth from Antigua or moral worth in Fanny. But this assumes a binary and a one-way exchange. One place is empty and is filled up from other places. In Emma and in Aisha, The heroines and their settings are not wanting within. The importations into Emma's and Aisha's small worlds, in the form of characters who have experience of other places, or, in Aisha, actual imported goods such as Western fashion and food, make them feel as though something is wanting in themselves and in their surroundings. On colonial assumptions, the only way for them to be filled up, as it were, is to place themselves at the center and assert their authority and superiority over others. But unlike in Mansfield Park, where Sir Thomas realizes too late that the imperial control he imposed on his household contributed to the disastrous endings for the previously privileged, Emma and Aisha find their ways to happy endings when they stop applying colonial-style power relations on the personal level. In the worlds of these handsome, clever, and rich heroines, importation doesn't have to imply a lack, but rather can add to an abundance. By rethinking the relationship and the value of center and periphery, here and elsewhere, self and other, both heroines come to find their place in the world where they already are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I have seen this movie twice now, and I feel like I need to go back because you pointed out so many things that I've missed in previous viewings. So thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Quickly would like to remind everyone that there's still time to drop your questions in the chat to talk about this film or anything related to Tristan's talk. Sorry, drop it in the Q&A box, not in the chat, in the Q&A box. And we're going to start with a question about this person asks that you've mentioned that the adaptations have problems dealing with the final separation between Emma and Harriet due to class. Is there a similar difficulty regarding Miss Bates, in particular the Box Hill incident and the quote unquote badly done set down?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. And just thinking about this film adaptation, there isn't really a Miss Bates at all. She does tend to drop out of the film adaptations altogether, doesn't she? Which is interesting. I mean, adaptations often kind of bulldoze over so-called minor characters, which, in Austen are never really totally minor, just as a way of kind of streamlining things, of course. But with Miss Bates, we have the problem that the way I see it, Austen kind of loves torturing her audience with Miss Bates. She lets her go on for pages sometimes, which is so entertainingly painful. The way she nails the way that character speaks. So I guess you would need a filmmaker who was equally willing to torture their audience, or perhaps even more so, because in a film it's harder to skip ahead if you're really, but exactly. I mean, this kind of thing seems to make modern audiences uncomfortable. And I sort of purposely said, it's modern wishes for a lack of class distinction rather than any kind of modern fact of a lack of class distinction. It seems like the novel faces these things that Austen was willing to face, but are, I think, increasingly difficult for later audiences and apparently filmmakers to take into account. And with Harriet, part of the difficulty with that relationship isn't just class, but also the difference in their intelligence as well as status. So for Mr. Knightley to say you should really be friends with Jane Fairfax, she's more on your level in more ways than one, right? So with Miss Bates, there's a whole bunch of issues gathered together. The fact that she's fallen from her place in society, the fact that she's an old maid, just makes all of those things compounded would increase the discomfort, I think.
Yeah, for me, I noticed with this viewing, it's harder in these modern adaptations in Clueless and in Aisha to forgive the heroine, as we might forgive Emma. We might just, oh, Emma might have been a product of her time, but seeing it brought to the modern realm and having to confront, as you say, that kind of this class distinctions that still exist already make it very uncomfortable for the viewer. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you.
And if I can pick up on that, actually, I think uh, one common reaction just from popular reviews of Aisha I've noticed online is that some viewers are kind of astounded as to how everything can be okay for her in the end, considering what she's done. Stuff I didn't talk about in the paper, such as her leading the Mr. Elton character and the Harriet character out into this supposedly dangerous part of Delhi and kind of abandoning them there at this hotel so that they can get to know each other. Nothing bad happens to her, even though it's supposed to be this dangerous place and she's like walking in the dark alone. And who would forgive someone for doing something like that to them? Emma, I don't think she does anything that bad. She does some pretty bad stuff. So I think that's an interesting choice, right? Like to make the heroine worse, but to really emphasize just how imaginary the world of her world and even the world of the film is, where everybody loves her, it's fine in the end. I think that's part of how colonialism is dealt in the movie too, and post-colonial issues, because as is pointed out in criticism of new Bollywood movies more widely, poverty has just kind of disappeared and inequality as problems.
In terms of likability and changes in characters, you mentioned the Pinky as similar to Dion in Clueless. What do you make of the inclusion of a best friend, for the Emma character? Do you think that audiences would be uncomfortable with the kind of isolation that she really has in the novel?
I think you're right. Yeah, I think that that question gets at one of the reasons for the inclusion of that character. It's probably a discomfort with her isolation and probably just preconceptions about what you need for a plot and for character interrelations in a film. Can you have this this female character who doesn't have anyone to play off of, as well as can you have a female character who's separated from her sister, who's gotten married and gone to London, and whose friend previously was her governess in this strange kind of power relation. I mean, that would be hard for modern audiences to relate to as well, I think. But something that I found fascinating when I realized it is that Clueless gets rid of Jane Fairfax. So there again, like Jane Fairfax is the potential friend who would be on her level intellectually and socially that she rejects. So that rather changes how we see the character and how we see the relationship with the Harriet character. So it's curious, isn't it, that maybe the Dion character gets introduced when the Jane Fairfax character drops out. And she ends up being a kind of a meld with Mrs. Elton, but not quite. Yeah. So in Aisha, you have the Jane Fairfax character being, I think, quite important, as my reading of the movie suggested, and yet they retain this other best friend, as well as the relationship with Harriet. So it's as if she can't be isolated, and I think the benefit of that is that you get the best friend that she can confide in, but you also have the relationship with Harriet, as opposed to the potential relationship with Jane Fairfax.
I think maybe it also helps. One of the social weapons in these two film adaptations is a kind of cliquishness. And that, I guess, wouldn't come across very well if Emma were in the Emma character were isolated. But those are wonderful points. I really, really enjoyed all of your comments, both in the presentation and now. Kimio, your turn.
Right. Is it okay to ask a question? Just because I just want to ask about the Irish national tale that you brought up today. It was so fascinating. I never actually thought about the colonial situation, bringing this issue of Sidney Owenson's description of Ireland and how it might possibly relate to Indian adaptation of Austen. And so I just want to hear a bit more about the connection between these two. You said something about Austen's time, Irish national tale was sort of, my understanding of your interpretation is that perhaps the Irish girl in this novel written by Lady Morgan is possibly an Indian girl represented in the adaptation, like Aisha. Is that a possible understanding? Because from my point of view, like Glorvina, for example, is a very traditional girl, although her internal thoughts are never portrayed. It's more like a descriptive, so everybody reading The Wild Irish Girl gets to see what she's wearing and what she's playing on the harp. We never actually connect with her thoughts, do we? I mean, so it was really interesting that you kind of connected the Irish context with Indian adaptation, because in this particular film, Aisha, we kind of links our thoughts with Aisha. She's the kind of focal point of this work, whereas in The Wild Irish Girl, Glorvina is almost like the other. Mm-hmm. So obviously, we have different points of view. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of, curious to know how you might approach Aisha's, how Aisha and Shafari, these two girls, are represented as the kind of traditional or a hybrid girl, because Glorvina never gets to be that kind of hybrid girl that perhaps we might see. I don't know. She does kind of see the progressive British culture coming in to Ireland.
Yeah,
how much she, welcomes. How she's not like Artie. She's not like Aisha. She's more of a Shafari character, although she never mimics. So there's so much complication in trying to understand these two contexts. So if you could kind of open up a little bit of your argument.
For sure, yeah, that helps me open it up an awful lot. Your points about point of view, and your points about this figure of the traditional national female or the female who doesn't leave the country, because that's Glorvina too. She lives in in this isolated place in Ireland, and Glorvina, though, through her education, has a broad mind and a view of the world, even if she hasn't personally visited, and even if she's very attached to the traditions of her own country. I mean, what attracted me to the connection and made me glad to see that folks had written about Emma and Ireland is the colonial aspect, you know, and I just found that really clever, the way that um, uh, Aisha has you know, the exotic setting being the centers of colonial power and neo-colonial power, whereas in the national tale, the exotic settings are the colonized places, especially because in these post-colonial retellings, you have another flip going on where the things are set in a post-colonial setting. So we have Shefali as the very traditional, not so educated character who doesn't really have an idea of the rest of the world, and we have Aisha, who is, you know, isolated and trying to attach herself to the rest of the world in these kind of surface ways, and I'm arguing like imaginary ways, that exoticization of the other place. So there's another flip, right? It's the what would be center is actually the exotic place from the other perspective. And what you were saying about point of view, I think, is really neat. Because yeah, it's with the epistolary form in the Wild Irish Girl, she's the object of the English male gaze, right? And that's how we see her. And you know, quite hilariously, the English male gaze who goes to Ireland and says, "Oh, among these savages," and then meets her and says how wrong I was about this wonderful people, you know. It actually has a certain amount calling for comparison to Pride and Prejudice there, with the way they deal with Mr. Darcy, which I don't like in Pride and Prejudice. But you know, the idea of the male love interest being this one who sees this foreign place through the eyes of, you know, expecting it to be inferior, filthy, backward, savage, and then comes around to appreciate the culture. And of course, in these, getting back to point of view of the heroines, the point of one of the points of these post-colonial adaptations is to switch the point of view so that you get the point of view of that which you don't get in the Wild Irish Girl. Funnily enough, right? Because Owenson is writing it as someone from Ireland, wanting to bring Irish culture to the English and more broadly, representing it, and yet represents it in this very kind of mediated way. Like it's not exactly the Irish person speaking up, but let me show you Ireland through the eyes of this British man. Let me show you the Irish woman through the eyes of this British man, which is even more interesting when you think of how Owenson performed Glorvina in her you know, social interactions. Like she was a celebrity and she would dress like the character dressed in the book and all of these things, right? Like there's that in-person authenticity where you get her directly, but not directly, because it's not really Glorvina, because Glorvina is a fictional character, and you know, so I think that takes us back to Austen's narrative mastery, you know, and the way she could easily and did write epistolary novels from singular points of view. But in Emma chooses to give us so much from the heroine's point of view, and you know, a heroine that she expects no one but myself will quite like. I also find it funny that we don't often have comments from Austen on any and all of her contemporary novelists, but I made sure to have written down what she said about Sydney Owenson. She makes a comment about another novel of hers in a letter to Cassandra.
I have it here too.
Oh, good. You were ready. We have got Ida of Athens by Miss Owenson. We have only read the preface yet, but her Irish girl does not make me expect much. If the
Ah,
warmth of her language could affect the body, it might be worth reading in this weather,
What a great line.
isn't it?
wow.
So yeah, Austen not very impressed by the Wild Irish
Yeah,
Girl, but thinking that it was very heated.
right.
And
That
I was
makes more sense.
thinking that it had been while she was writing Emma, but it's 1809.
Yeah.
But not too long before writing Emma.
Mm. Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much.
We have another question from the audience, and I'm going to read this one exactly from the Q&A because I think it has a really interesting insight. So this person writes, I haven't watched the movie yet, so I'm wondering, in the movie, is Artie actually South Indian? Do we know? As someone of South Indian descent myself, my question is whether her be a South Indian bride is actually based on what I see as a common stereotype in India of South Indians being more traditional and frankly frumpy than North Indians.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Because I wondered about that myself when reading the article that says she's dressed just like a South Indian bride, because we don't get to learn a lot about Artie's backstory in the movie. I mean, almost all we know really is what Arjun says when he defends her and says some people come back because they miss their family and friends, which would make me think, if she's come back to Delhi, then that's where her family and friends are. So I think your question kind of hits a nail on the head that if they're trying to perform uh, tradition uh, and Indianness, like really authentic traditional Indianness, this is the kind of clothing they use for that performance, that kind of appearance they use for that performance. Um, Interestingly, underscoring the way, well, already in the Shefali character, you have the way Indianness is perceived in these different ways, like westernized Indian, not so westernized Indian, and then traditional Indian as having kind of ranks and uh, cultural preconceptions attached to them. So, whether the movie is just replicating those things or making those things part of its whole critique of, why do we think of sophistication in these ways, would be an interesting question. I think it's kind of up in the air. I wouldn't be able to say for sure myself.
I guess I think bridges nicely to a question from Sonia Kamal here. It's about do you see a connection between Aisha and Chadda's Pride and Prejudice? And when you were speaking just now, I pictured the Mary Bennett character in Bride and Prejudice performing her cobra dance, which is, I think, meant to be pejoratively traditional.
Yeah.
Or so I'm curious whether that's a connection that you see, or whether there are other connections that you see between Aisha and Bride and Prejudice, because I know you have mentioned that you're not that fond of Bride and Prejudice as well.
Yes, I have to confess I'm not. I rewatched it though, and I found a lot that was interesting in it. So I like it a little better than I thought I did, if that reassures anybody. But yeah, I like what you said about the snake dance, because I do think like it's meant to be embarrassingly traditional, like, oh, in Indian culture is well, almost like actually almost like what Aisha says about Kajra. you know, like this overly sexy dance that she's referring to as a comparison to what Arti is singing at Diwali. Um, this being an aspect of Indian culture that is off-putting or seems again, barbarian, savage to a Western observer, and maybe is something that sophisticated Indian folks would want to kind of sweep under the carpet. But that actually is one of the reasons why I like Aisha better than Bride and Prejudice, because something that I found about Bride and Prejudice and put me off the first time I watched it, because a lot of it happens like right at the beginning, is a kind of putting itself down as a Bollywood style movie. Like at the first song and dance scene, the Caroline Bingley character, who, we can expect to say annoying things, of course, but, she says, oh, he's going to turn into MC Hammer. As if it's obligatory to say, oh, these dance scenes are so lame and embarrassing, as well as, I mean, the main thing that ruins that movie for me is the characterization of Darcy. I mean, you might as well just stab me in the heart if you're going to make Darcy a racist corporate, a-hole, which I think they kind of do in that movie. So I question his redemption in the end. So I think that's kind of what I would say about the relationship or the comparison between Aisha and Bride and Prejudice. Bollywood movies, of course, often get very self-referential and self-mocking about the conventions, but in a kind of a fond way. Whereas I find Bride and Prejudice tries so hard to mediate to a Western audience to whom all of this stuff is just alien and weird, rather than, mocking it gently to an audience who knows how this kind of stuff works. And then, Aisha is the sort of new Bollywood style without a lot of the song and dance. But is engaging very much with those newer conventions too.
So it might partly be a product of being jointly produced also by, I believe it's 3 countries jointly producing Bride and Prejudice, right? I think it's a UK, US, and Indian production. So maybe that's part of where that ambivalence comes from. But I should give Kimio a chance to ask a last question here.
Okay, so there's a question. I'm just going to read it out to you. What, if anything, does Aisha, the film, say about patriarchy compared to patriarchy in Emma? The 2 father figures are very different. I think this question is really interesting, because I was also going to ask you a similar question, kind of connecting to what I was saying earlier about Erasmus Darwin. Obviously, Austen read so many, texts, including Darwin, and she was writing in that kind of context where patriarchal culture, was the dominant ideology. And so obviously, Emma does try to kind of overturn that sort of value as well by kind of having strong female character, just like Darwin's female plants, like the queen of there's this queen sort of representation. I think I almost see Darwin's queen character like sort of the heroine of Emma. And so it was interesting when you said that Gopal, I think this critic talks about Aisha as kind of changing slightly the patriarchal character, like eating carrot pudding together with her daughter. I don't know whether that's relevant or not, but she's saying that family and friends in India are no longer obstacles in these kind of films. They're enablers. You said earlier. So I guess this question really is, an interesting one for me too. If you could kind of explain a little about the difference between the original novel Emma and how this Aisha, the film, has adapted this patriarchal culture or values, or how male figures are represented.
Thanks. I'd be happy to talk about that. But before I do, I just wanted to say I just realized I got carried away in talking about Pride and Prejudice in the last question and forgot to say, Sonia Kamal asked the question. I'm so glad you're here, Sonia Kamal.
Oh.
I'm delighted to have your response to the things that I was thinking about, and participation as an audience member in the series. This is so great. So patriarchy, yes, indeed. Kind of a two-pronged question. I like what you're doing with Erasmus Darwin and Jane Austen, because of course Erasmus Darwin, partly because of what he's doing, but partly just because of the necessities of Linnaean botanical taxonomy. You always have as Horace Walpole put it, the ladies are the ones that have the harems rather than the men. There's always more male partners catering to fewer females. So a female-dominated world in a lot of ways in the loves of the plants, and such a variety of gender roles that he represents. So some very strong females indeed. So yeah, I think we can see Austen doing that as well. And with the marriage plot, Austen is doing that sort of thing, where you have the pictured courtships between, not just one male and one female, but all of these different possibilities, and then eventually, almost perforce, the heroines have to settle down with one. But that question in the background of, well, why? Why one? Especially, in situations where each of them has their attractions, right? Like why do you have to go with the steady one? It's probably good that you had a little bit of fun with the unsteady one beforehand. But I love what happens with the Mr. Woodhouse character. I think it's fairly clear that part of what's going on in Aisha with the father owes a lot to Clueless. Because Clueless had already changed the father character in that way, where they have this close relationship and she kind of, looks out for him and that, but he's very capable and very successful, very different. So that, I think that part of what the effect there is that it changes. It goes back to what we were saying about the likability and forgivability of the heroine, because in a lot of ways we can feel for Emma because of having to take care of her father, who needs her so much and is pretty demanding. And we see, other characters not have as much patience with him as she has. For all her lack of patience with Miss Bates, she has a ton of patience for her father, and her reluctance to marry because she's devoted to, like, it as selfish and superior as she may be. This really shows her virtue, her relationship with her father. So that alters that for the modern characters. And again, perhaps the discomfort with that kind of patriarch might be more, I wonder, for modern viewers than for Austen era readers, where she's definitely pulling down the patriarch. And even if Mr. Knightley is a replacement patriarch, I love the ways in which he's not traditionally masculine. Like, he thinks of things that men wouldn't. Bringing apples because Jane Fairfax likes them, ordering the carriage when he never uses it. So in Aisha, having this new and different father gives her this confidant and gives them this warm relationship and opens things out a bit, as I was suggesting. I don't really think it would be possible to have a father like Mr. Woodhouse in Aisha because of the connotations it would have of that kind of enclosure and wanting quite literally to stay inside.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tristan. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. Please stick around as we have a few announcements to make, including future events. First off, I want to give another shout out to Sonia Kamal, who I should probably mention gave our very first virtual Jane Austen and Company talk.
That's right.
All the way well over, oh gosh, a year or 2 years ago. But you can watch that Food, Family, and Identity with Sonali Deb and Sonia Kamal for free on our website. So a great past event to catch up with. And as for future events, we have two events in February coming up. On February 11th, we've got Jane Austen and India, Jane Austen in India. This is with Dr. Barnita Bagchi, who is going to be talking about Jane Austen's familial connections with India. Before talking about the Austinian resonances in 19th century Indian woman writer Kashibai Karnatar. Now, this is going to take place a little earlier in the day as our speaker is in Europe. So just make that note. This is going to be 10 a.m. Eastern time. So grab a cup of coffee. You can listen to it in the background. If you're working remotely, come join us on February 11th. And then we've got on February 17th, Jane Austen in Takarazuka Musical Theater, which those of you who were with us during Noriyuki Harada's talk will recognize. Takarazuka is an all-female musical troupe in Japan with a very interesting history, and they produced a very unique adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And then there's one on March 3rd that is not up here because we are still in the process of confirming the title. But what I can tell you guys now is it's going to talk about ceramics and architecture and the influences brought over to England from Asia. So we will announce that talk once we have those final details for you all. So be sure to follow our Facebook page and to read the emails because that announcement is going to be coming up very soon.
Sorry, I just had to make sure. Yes, not muted. Yes, and if you want to read more about Jane Austen, her life, afterlives, and adaptations, check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program or follow us on social media. JASP is a 4-day symposium that typically takes place in June in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And this year's theme is Austen and Shakespeare, taking place June 16th through 19th, 2022. So join us for lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, exhibits, and other activities that blend scholarship with fandom. Registration is open and the early bird tickets are almost sold out. There's only 2 or 3 left, so be sure you register at janeaustensummer.org. I was looking through the chat and several of you have said that you're registered and looking forward to JASP, and we're looking forward to having you as well.
Thank you for the many people who joined us tonight, from those who braved the cold in Canada and those who braved the heat in Australia and in Brazil. I guess it sounded like it was just pleasantly sunny in Brazil, but thank you all very much for coming, and for our friends in Japan as well, and all across the US. This program was supported by some small grants from North Carolina Humanities Council and the UNC's Humanities for the Public Good and the Carolina Asia Center. Please do consider making a gift to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We are a registered nonprofit, so in the US at least, your donations are tax deductible. And it helps us bring in wonderful, talented speakers like Tristanne and keep our events free for everyone. They go to supporting all our activities, which includes providing teacher scholarships for reduced and free attendance to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We are starting a new promotion just in time for Valentine's Day. So we will be selling our trademark ampersand as pendants and cufflinks starting next week. They're great Valentine's or birthday or graduation presents. So keep your eye out for that. And thank you all once again for attending. Thank you, Tristanne, for a fabulous talk. And please all remain healthy and safe until we meet again. Bye.